It's hard to live in modern-day America and not hear about climate change and environmental damage. Recycling bins are becoming more and more common, and every month in the news there's another article about the rising temperatures of the polar ice caps. Endangered species are losing their habitats to human development. They flock to the safety of national parks and monuments. Wildlife organizations attempt to protect the landscapes and species of the world in earnest. This move to preserve natural resources is shockingly young. 150 years ago, there were no national parks, and the conservation movement was practically non-existent. It was only with the rise of the Progressive Era and Theodore Roosevelt's presidency that the conservation of natural resources by the United States government truly began. Through his usage of the Antiquities Act of 1906, Theodore Roosevelt took a stand in history by establishing a national importance in protecting the environment and by setting a precedent for future presidents' conservation efforts. Theodore Roosevelt was born on October 27, 1858 in New York City. Even at a young age, he was extremely passionate about the environment. Roosevelt attended Harvard and studied biology and zoology, among other things. After the death of his wife Alice, Teddy moved to the Dakota Territory to experience life as a cattle rancher. Roosevelt's experiences in New York and in the West allowed him to witness firsthand how Americans were abusing their natural resources. His conservationist ideals formed from observations he made early in life. Theodore Roosevelt became president after William McKinley's assassination in 1901. His presidency occurred during a time in American history called the Progressive Era. The Progressive Era spanned from 1890 to 1920 and featured a plethora of reform movements. The reformers were mainly middle class and included many women. They called for consumer protection, regulation of corporations, voting rights for women, and conservation of natural resources, among other things. Environmentalism played into the Progressive Era ideals. At this time, land speculators and developers were exploiting natural resources, particularly in the West. As the population of the West increased, the country became more and more wasteful and destructive. Fortunately, large numbers of Americans were beginning to appreciate the value of the shrinking natural landscape. The two contradicting environmental philosophies at this time were preservationism and conservationism. John Muir led the preservationists and believed in leaving the environment untouched by humanity. However, conservationists such as Gifford Pinchot argued for regulation of human usage of the environment. They believed in managing resources responsibly, while Muir and his followers wanted to leave land completely untouched. Though Roosevelt was influenced by John Muir, he was a conservationist and appointed Gifford Pinchot as chief of the U.S. Forest Service. Increased environmental conservation by the government also fell in line with the progressive idea of increased government power. Theodore Roosevelt entered the White House at the perfect time to make big changes. Before Roosevelt's presidency, the creation of national parks and monuments was a painstakingly tedious process. Any land set aside for protection needed congressional approval, and this was often difficult to come by. As a result, there were few national parks and monuments. Starting in 1900, Congress began working to create an act to remedy this problem. The Antiquities Act gives the president the power to establish national monuments to protect important archaeological and scientific sites. This way, more national monuments could be created in a shorter amount of time. The primary force behind the act was Congressman John F. Lacey. Lacey, a Republican representative from Iowa and chairman of House Committee of Public Lands, was an influential conservationist. The 1900 Bird and Game Act was nicknamed the Lacey Act due to his role in heading its creation. Lacey modeled the Antiquities Act after a substitute bill drafted by Binger Herman in 1900. The bill provided the three most important policies for the act: government regulation of archaeological and scientific sites, government overseeing of site usage, and the goal of advancing knowledge of the protected sites. Congress heavily debated the extent to which the president would be allowed to create so-called national monuments. Giving the president so much authority scared some, but others felt that it was necessary. It simply took Congress too long to agree on the creation of monuments. In January of 1906, Lacey brought the Antiquities Act in its final form before the House of Representatives. Thomas Patterson, a senator from Colorado, introduced the same bill to the Senate a month later. The final Antiquities Act was only a page long and contained 3 sections. The first section outlawed the harming of government-protected sites. The second section gave the president the power to declare sites of historical or scientific interest national monuments. In reference to monument size, the act stated, "the limits of which in all cases shall be confined to the smallest area compatible with proper care and management of the objects to be protected. This statement proved to be extremely loosely interpreted by Roosevelt. The third section allowed permits to be granted for excavation and research of national monuments for scientific or educational purposes. Theodore Roosevelt signed the Antiquities Act on June 8, 1906, and wasted no time putting it to use. He declared Devil's Tower America's first national monument on September 24th of that year. He made his stance on American conservation very clear. His interpretation of the Antiquities Act, differing from that of Congress, was that the president should set aside large amounts of protected land. Based on Roosevelt's previous actions, his vigorous usage of the Antiquities Act was no surprise. During his earlier years of presidency, Roosevelt had already enacted conservation regimes. He had used the Forest Reserve Act so much that Congress passed an amendment limiting his ability to set aside more land. Roosevelt found a way around the Forest Reserve Act by using the Antiquities Act. His stand in showing that America's wildlife was worth protecting caused the Antiquities Act to be frequently used by future presidents, which was not its original intention. In total, Roosevelt created 18 monuments and set aside 1.5 million acres. Theodore Roosevelt had multiple opponents. Many businessmen felt threatened by his actions. One such case revolved around the Grand Canyon. Roosevelt first visited the Grand Canyon in 1903 and was struck by its beauty. He reflected, "I could not choose words that convey or that could convey to any outsider what that canyon is. I want to ask you to do one thing in connection with it in your own interest and in the interest of the country, to keep this great wonder of nature as it now is." However, despite the president's powerful words, the Grand Canyon was already being developed for economic purposes. When Ralph Cameron decided to build a trolley line across the south rim of the canyon, Roosevelt put his foot down. On January 11, 1908, he used the Antiquities Act to establish the Grand Canyon as a national monument, setting aside over 800,000 acres. Cameron became extremely angry that his business plans had been thwarted. He became a senator for Arizona and sued the government, taking his case to the Supreme Court, where Roosevelt's declaration was eventually upheld in 1920. The president at the time, Woodrow Wilson, even added acreage to the monument and gave it national park status. The creation of Grand Canyon National Park a month after Theodore Roosevelt's death was perhaps the most direct way his use of the Antiquities Act affected America. However, Roosevelt's stand for conservationism set an important precedent for future presidents and greatly shaped their usage of the Antiquities Act.
If there had been a different president involved when the Antiquities Act was first passed, and if someone who might have been reluctant to use it that much, it probably would have set a different precedent to say, well, we're not going to use it very often. President Roosevelt used it enough so that future presidents could feel like, well, President Roosevelt did it, I can do it too.
Roosevelt used the act often and created monuments in a wide variety of sizes. El Morro was a mere 160 acres, while the Grand Canyon stretched over 800,000. Essentially, future presidents had no restraints on how big or small the monuments they created were to be. Roosevelt was also very careful to point out exactly what part of his monuments were of archaeological or scientific interest. By doing so, Roosevelt ensured that his actions were credible and legal. Future presidents followed his lead in declaring monuments for the purposes that the Antiquities Act was made for. The Antiquities Act established a foundation for future conservation acts to be created on. It also became a loophole for establishing national parks. National parks receive more protection and government funding than monuments do. However, Congress must approve of national parks. After a monument is created through the Antiquities Act, Congress is more likely to allow it to become a national park. In 1978, President Jimmy Carter used the Antiquities Act to establish 17 national monuments totaling 56 million acres in Alaska. After his bold actions, Congress eventually relented and signed the Alaska Lands Act. President Barack Obama protected hundreds of millions of acres under the Antiquities Act, including the largest protected marine area in the world, located off the Hawaiian Islands. In total, 152 national monuments have been created under the Antiquities Act of 1906. Many have gone on to become national parks. When he signed the Antiquities Act, Theodore Roosevelt took a stand for his country's wildlife. He declared that the environment was worth protecting and that the president would have the power to do so. He broadened the way the act could be used to enable his successors to follow in suit. However, the pieces of land laid aside by the Antiquities Act are fragile. Congress can still pass laws to revoke national monuments. With climate change and pollution, even the protections currently placed on America's national parks and monuments may not be enough. Theodore Roosevelt took a stand in an attempt to show America the true value of its natural resources. Whether he succeeded remains to be seen.